My name is Dr. Christopher King, and I am an associate professor and chair of the Department of Health Systems Administration at Georgetown University. And my teaching, research, scholarship practice is all around how do we create equitable systems of care, recognizing that a person's health is mostly shaped by where they live, work, eat, and play. So how do we redesign the nation's healthcare delivery system to address those nuances and ensure that all people, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, income, insurance status, how do we make sure that all people have access to high quality healthcare? Again, thank you for this opportunity. It's such an important topic. In the midst of an era where the core values and the systems that govern our democracy are being questioned, it's a pleasure for me to take a moment to share some insight on our history and the impact that our history has had and continues to have on health outcomes and the state of our nation's healthcare delivery system. Currently, healthcare expenditures, they represent approximately 18% of the nation's gross domestic product. That's $6 trillion. And per capita, we are spending approximately 2 times more than other industrialized countries. Not to mention we're sicker and we experience higher rates of social ills associated with violence and mental illness. And I'd be remiss not to mention that we contend with significant health disparities, and racial minorities are disproportionately burdened by an assortment of preventable illnesses and chronic disease conditions. And while we are not, while the factors, there are many factors that help explain these dynamics, one thing we know for sure is that eradicating racial disparities and improving the health of this nation will require us to reckon with our past. It will require us to critically examine the systems and structures that got us here. And we'll have to use that information to undo the damage. So I have 6 overarching goals, objectives for this session. One is to contextualize the factors that shape health and well-being. I think it's important for us to do that. Also, to reflect on Western colonization and the effect it has had and continues to have on the systems and structures that govern our society. I'll share some examples of how colonial mentality shows up in contemporary health settings. We'll examine the complexity of patriotism in the context of colonialism and examine how forms of injustice and oppression affect health and access to timely healthcare services. And lastly, defend the imperative to commit to the founding principles and values that govern our democracy. So as we prepare to take a step into our history, there are 2 frameworks I'd like to share with you. Based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in order for us to live our best lives and really be the best that we can be, basic needs such as food, water, and shelter must be met. We must be safe and secure. We need connection. We need meaningful relationships and community and a sense of connection, right? And as we go through our lived experiences, healthy development is contingent upon growth, accomplishments, and recognition. Now, when there are deficits in this framework, we have a problem. Moreover, when we think about the factors that shape our health, we know that clinical care represents approximately 20%. The rest is shaped by the physical environment, the social and economic conditions in which we live, and health behaviors, which in many cases are correlated with those social and economic conditions. So this means we cannot rely on the healthcare delivery system alone to bear the responsibility for the brunt of an individual or a population's health. So now I want to go into colonialism, which is the practice, it's a policy or a practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So by definition, this means the original occupants are likely to be marginalized, they're likely to be disenfranchised, and likely to experience harsh realities. For the United States, it was Native Americans who arrived in approximately 16,000 BC. It should be noted that for generations prior to Western colonization, Native Americans established culture, heritage, and ways of life that reflected Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in 1492, Christopher Columbus arrives and observes a land that is rich in natural resources, a land that has great promise for economic opportunity. And I'll read this quote. This is Columbus speaking. "They all go around as naked as their mothers bore them. They could easily be commanded and made to work. They sew and do whatever might be needed to build towns and to be taught to wear clothes and adopt our ways. And they are the best people in the world, and above all, regentless." In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law. At that time, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived on millions of acres in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, land that their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. By the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern portion of the United States. And at that time, white settlers wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land. So the federal government forced them to leave their homeland and walk for miles to specifically designated Indian territories that were located across the Mississippi River. And I'd be negligent not to highlight the transatlantic slave trade. In white settlers' efforts to cultivate land, nearly 328,000 Africans were shipped to the United States, each coming with a price tag and purchased for labor in some of the most deplorable conditions. So let's just take a moment and sit on this. Families were broken, bodies were beaten, conditions were unsanitary, they could not read or write, they were perceived as intellectually inferior, subhuman beings, and they were treated as such. It should be noted that the slave trade commerce shaped what we now refer to as American capitalism, and their unpaid work in sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton fields helped generate wealth among white settlers and landowners. And what about their orientation to medical care? Slaves were property. When they were sick, they needed medical care from a physician who was likely to engage in uncivilized, unethical experimental procedures. And as people, this was their orientation into the American medical system. Now, the legacy, the effect of this legacy shows up today. It shows up in how care is delivered, and it shows up in how people perceive the healthcare delivery system. On this slide, I share just a few medical fallacies on how Blacks were perceived by the medical community. In comparison to whites, Blacks were perceived to have thicker skin, blood that coagulated faster, have a higher pain tolerance, predisposed to violence, smaller brains, and less respiratory capacity. Now, these beliefs were institutionalized in the evolution of the medical system in America. I show this timeline to keep things in perspective. The first enslaved Africans were brought to this country in 1526, and slavery was legal through 1865. By policy, segregation ended in 1954. So I think you know where I'm going, right? It's now 2020. So out of 424 years, slavery and segregation were systemically institutionalized for 428 of those years, or approximately 86% of the total time period. My friends, this is going to take a long time to undo. And given what we know about intergenerational trauma and what we know about stress and epigenetics and bias and discrimination, health disparities should be no surprise to us. 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, asserting that people have certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and moreover, positing that men were created equal. Clearly, the Declaration of Independence did not apply to all people. Slavery was legal when the document was signed, which is why Black Americans celebrate Juneteenth. The official emancipation of slavery occurred on June 19, 1865. This is just one example of how complicated the relationship is when we think about Blacks, African Americans, and people of color when it comes to American heritage, pride, and expressions of patriotism, which is defined as love for one's country, right? Characteristics are presented on this slide: special affection for one's country, a sense of personal identification with the country, special concern for the well-being of the country, and willingness to sacrifice to promote the country's good. Given the experience of people of color in the wake of Western colonization and economic exploitation, how do we reconcile this? What does atonement look like? Are we able to connect the dots between marginalization and wealth creation, income, home ownership, and education? And speaking of education, let's not forget about Carl Brigham, creator of the SAT in 1926 to uphold a racial caste system. Brigham was a believer in eugenics, concluding that Blacks were intellectually inferior. As I think about this, I can't help but think about the doors that were closed to generations of talented people of color simply because they fared poorly on a racially biased standardized assessment. And while Jim Crow laws espouse separate but equal, we know that the quality of services and the structural conditions of those communities of color, they were vastly different. These laws they restricted access to opportunity and high quality services, resulting in long-term consequences. And as we think about the racial wealth gap, we must not forget about the impact of redlining, which was born out of Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. While redlining deprived people of color of wealth creation, it also led to high concentrations of poverty, social ills, and mental health conditions. Again, we see these trends in historically marginalized communities today. And residential segregation is such a reliable indicator of the health of a community that there's an index for it. It's called the Residential Segregation Index. It measures the degree in which two or more groups live separately from one another. So now I'd like to bring us up to more current times. Again, in light of Western colonization, where are we as a nation? What are those salient issues and how are we addressing them? In our activism to correct injustice and promote racial healing, I think we're all aware of the statues that exist across the country that symbolize pain and hurt for so many of our brothers and sisters. These are just a few pictures of Confederate officers that have been held in US history as heroes. Well, healthcare is not immune. This is a statue of James Merriam Sims, who is celebrated in medicine as the father of gynecology. While he was touted as a hero in medicine, the stories of Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy were untold. In his effort to correct vaginal fistulas, he conducted experimental procedures on these women. They were slaves. And through the work that he did, what he learned from working on slaves led to advancements in knowledge around women's health. And I think today, I think we've probably all heard about the high rates of maternal mortality in Black women. There's been a lot of dialogue about the causal factors, but I think we can credit James Sims' influence in how the gynecological community has been implicitly and explicitly trained to interact with Black women. those vestiges remain today, and they contribute to maternal mortality rates that we see. Even today, race is perceived as a biological risk factor. We know this is not the case, right? We know that race is a social construct, and COVID-19 is amplifying this truth. For example, nationally, death rates for Blacks, Hispanics, and Indigenous people, those death rates are higher than whites. These rates are not higher because of biological differences. They're higher because of the social and environmental conditions in which folks live, coupled with disparities in timely access to high quality medical care. Actually, my colleagues and I just had our national investigation published on quality hospitals and the community dynamics in which they are housed. Using the 5-star CMS high quality rating methodology, we found that 4- and 5-star hospitals are more likely to be in affluent, high income, highly educated, predominantly white communities. And earlier I talked about medical fallacies that originated in colonial times. Even today, those perceptions persist. In 2016, Hoffman, a Princeton researcher, and her colleagues found that medical students think there is a biological difference between Blacks and whites. Differences in blood coagulation and skin thickness were most commonly cited fallacies. And when we control for factors such as income, insurance status, education, employment, there are still racial differences in patient experiences and patient outcomes. Again, this is more data, and it reinforces that we have a serious problem that must be addressed if we're going to improve the health of the country. Earlier, I shared this image with you for context. I have a question for you. Are we really in the green zone? Are we? Here are a couple of examples of why I beg to differ. Despite the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, voter suppression continues to be real. Gerrymandering is real, disenfranchising racial minorities and underrepresented populations. Now, when people are not represented, their needs and their interests are ignored in policy. Their life, their liberty, their pursuit of happiness becomes an unattainable American ideology. And locus of control, whether it's real or perceived, is compromised. And for those of us in healthcare, we are left with the consequences, right? It shows up in poor mental health that we need to be responsible for and address. It's manifested through ER visits, which could have been prevented had the individual or the population had access to high quality primary care, or if the individual just lived in a community that had the infrastructure for healthy living. Mass incarceration is another reason I argue that we are not in that green zone. The United States represents 5% of the world's population, yet 25%, again, 25% of the world's prisoners. The United States has 25% of the world's prisoners. And in the United States, rates are higher, right? Those rates are higher in people of color when compared with whites, Hispanics. So when we compare with whites, Hispanics are slightly lower than 2 times higher. American Indians and Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders greater than 2 times. American Indians, less than 3 times. Blacks, greater than 5 times, again, when compared with whites. So this is a problem, and it certainly isn't because Blacks are predisposed or any of these other populations are predisposed to violence or more likely to commit crimes when compared with whites. Moreover, incarceration disparities are not solely the result of a criminal justice system that was designed to criminalize Blacks. In addition to that, it is the result of a racial injustice that is pervasive in the systems and the structures that govern our society. These injustices are deeply rooted and often subtle and implicit, yet they are normalized in how we experience the world. So how do we fix this, right? Well, unfortunately, I don't have the magic wand, but I do know that Americans must learn about Western colonization and its impact on people of color. Americans must come to terms with the complicated relationship that exists between people of color and America's founding documents, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which recognized slaves as 3/5 of a person for census purposes. Americans must recognize how racialized fallacies about biology and intelligence persist even today. It's 2020. Americans must recognize the origins of racial wealth gaps and how those gaps influence access to opportunity and health outcomes. Americans must realize how racial bias is baked into the DNA of our society. When all people are not given a fair shot, and those trends have occurred for more than 400 years, we undo the damage by applying an equity lens. This means we cultivate a society that distributes resources according to need. So what you see here, if you look on the left-hand side, the apples represent opportunity, right? And so equality means that you're giving everyone the same thing, right? But as you see depicted on the left, the individuals are different heights, right? And so equality doesn't work for all of those individuals, does it? But equity does. This is when we distribute resources according to need, which is depicted on the right-hand side. When we distribute resources according to need, this helps ensure that all people have access to opportunity. And if we do not learn to do this, health disparities and healthcare costs that are related to those disparities will continue to be exacerbated. Moreover, economic productivity of the nation will be compromised, which is why I would argue that the president's executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping is a threat to the overall well-being of the country and an insult to the civil rights movement. What the order is intended to do is dismiss or disregard the original sin and its vestiges in contemporary society. What the order is intended to do is stop the progress of unearthing deep-seated issues in our country and educating the masses about those inequities. What the order is intended to do is put an end to the session like you are experiencing right now. And here's even more evidence of why it's important. In 2016, the median household income for whites was 8 times higher than Hispanics and 10 times higher than Blacks. This must be resolved if we're going to, again, eradicate racial differences in health outcomes. Despite the current administration's approach, I am optimistic about the future. As a professor, I have the opportunity to work with this next generation, a racially diverse generation that is not tolerating the ways of racial inequality. They are not standing for it. And living in the nation's capital and seeing all of these wonderful, very passionate people peacefully protest for a world, for a community, for a country that is just, brings such hope and inspiration for so many. And we're very proud of the energy and the commitment that these young people bring with us as we really work towards moving towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope that this was helpful. And I just have the most respect for each of you and the work that you do each and every day. to improve the health of the communities you serve, one patient at a time. Thank you.